Good morning, everybody. We have reached Mark chapter 14, verse 21 and following this morning, and we're looking at the subject of the King crucified. If you are familiar with the four Gospels, then I imagine you are familiar with Jesus as teacher and healer. But you may not immediately recognize him as King. This morning we're going to begin by looking at what the accounts have to say about Jesus the King. We don't have time to look at all of the New Testament evidence, so we're going to restrict our attention where possible to the last 24 hours of his life. And it'll be puzzling if I don't mention to you that I plan to work backwards through the accounts from the end towards the beginning. I think it may be helpful to us this morning. So let's begin by thinking about Jesus. Was he king? And what about crucifixion? If we go towards the end of the story, we see that he is hanging on a cross and there is a sign fixed over his head. And John tells us that many of the Jews read this sign. He is obviously appealing to common knowledge in the Jerusalem area for many years afterwards. And he justifies the claim that many of the Jews had read the sign by pointing out that the site of the crucifixion was close to one of the city gates. People were coming in and out and saw the sign as they went past. But he also appeals to the fact that the sign was presented in three languages, namely Greek and Aramaic and Latin. So then, for those who could read, there were options that would allow them to understand the meaning. And the message was, this is Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. The sign itself declared why he was there and who he was. He was identified as king. Before the crucifixion itself, there were earlier clues. We see them in the behavior of the Roman garrison before they led him out to the cross to crucify him. We're told that the garrison was called when Jesus was handed over to them, that they dressed him in a special robe, that they twisted a crown of thorns and placed it on his head, and that a staff was put in his hand, mimicking the scepter of a king. But they went further than that. They mocked him by acting out homage, kneeling to him, as though he were royalty. It's clear that for the Roman garrison, this man was being identified as a king. Their behavior was foreshadowed by the treatment that Jesus received at the hands of Herod and his soldiers and court. Herod was the tetrarch of Galilee, that is, the king of one of the four regions. And before Jesus was returned to Pontius Pilate, his men too had placed a special robe on him and mocked him. If we go back earlier still to the cross-examination at the hands of Pilate, governor of Judea, we see that Pilate focuses on this question: are you a king? And that set the agenda. That was the charge against Jesus, that he was a king, and therefore in some sense represented competition to Caesar, who was Pilate's master. Or if we go back further still, before the Jewish authorities had handed Jesus over into Roman custody, they had considered testimony against Jesus. And they found that the testimony didn't agree. and eventually the chief priest, acting in a role as prosecutor, compelled Jesus to speak in answer to a question. And the question was, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" And Jesus was compelled to give his answer and to affirm that he was. The question was, "Are you the Christ?" And Luke is very careful to explain to us that the title Christ means a king. We see then that for the Jewish authorities, the question hinged on whether or not Jesus claimed to be a king. Going back further still, the night before, we see Jesus at the Last Supper with his disciples, and in the account that Luke records for us, they are preoccupied with their relative standing one with another. And Jesus talks about his kingdom and the kingdoms that he will confer on them in the future. Or go back earlier still that evening, and we see Jesus alerting his disciples to what's about to happen, and he describes himself as the shepherd. He foretells that the shepherd will be struck and that the flock, his disciples, will be scattered. And the shepherd is a familiar Old Testament word which can represent someone who looks after sheep, but it can also represent somebody who is ruler of a nation. There seems then to be good reason to conclude that Jesus was king, that he thought of himself as in some sense a king, that he was willing to acknowledge that, and that was the focus of the crucifixion. It had previously been possible to ask whether or not Jesus might be the promised king, although it had never been easy. We're told, for example, that John the Baptist sent men to Jesus to inquire of him. But John the Baptist was already in prison, and therefore there wasn't much more that could be done to penalize him for such behavior. We're told that Simon the Pharisee invited Jesus to a meal in public, but Simon did so in a manner that was offensive and certainly not calculated to make anybody think that he was impressed with this itinerant teacher. Nicodemus, who was one of the inner circle of chief priests and Pharisees, sought Jesus out, but he did so by night. And we're told that the people who were attending the feast of the dedication of the temple discussed whether or not Jesus was the promised king, because the authorities allowed him to continue to be at large, but the discussions were carried on in whispers. However, when the Sanhedrin assembled in the small hours of the morning after Jesus had been seized, the question was no longer a matter of private conscience. Instead, Jesus' affirmation was considered blasphemous, and he, therefore, was considered to be worthy of death. If you have followed me thus far, then you already know that the authorities had sentenced Jesus to death by crucifixion. But you may not be aware that condemnation and execution on the cross were thought to invalidate his claim to be a king. There are several clues to this. The first is the rejection of Jesus by his own people. Invited to choose between Barabbas and Jesus, that is, between the known murderer and the well-known teacher and healer, it was the guilty man they had released, and the innocent they condemned. "Crucify him," they shouted. And when Pilate attempted to reason with them, they shouted all the louder, crucify him. Not only his own people, but also their religious leaders condemned him. I've already mentioned that his right to remain silent was overridden when the chief priest chose to act for the prosecution. He was compelled to give an answer which they had already decided to consider as blasphemous. He acknowledged himself to be the Christ, and they disregarded the possibility that this might in fact be true. Not only the religious leaders, but also his disciples, his friends and servants, were told that they did not rise up to prevent his arrest by the Jews. So at this point in the account, there is no evidence of a government, nothing in the behaviour of the disciples, religious leaders or people which might support Jesus' claim to be a king. But in answering Pilate, Jesus had said, "My kingdom is not of this world." So we have to ask ourselves whether condemnation and execution were consistent with a different kind of kingship. He saved others, said the chief priests and teachers of the law, but he can't save himself. They compared his evident helplessness on the cross with his earlier claims to forgive sins. They seem to infer that if he cannot save himself from under the judgment of men, how then can he claim to save others from under the judgment of God? The Old Testament insists that if a man guilty of a capital offence is put to death and his body is hung on a tree, you must not leave his body on the tree overnight. Be sure to bury him that same day, because anyone who is hung on a tree is under God's curse. It's clear from the accounts that we've been looking at that the Jews took this very seriously. Because the Jews did not want the bodies left on the crosses during the Sabbath, they asked Pilate to have the legs broken and the bodies taken down. Moreover, from the same passage, they appear to have taken seriously this notion of a curse. They conclude that a man could not be the king of Israel and under God's curse. Mark records their mocking words for us. "Let this King of Israel come down now from the cross, that we may see and believe." It seems to have been the settled conviction of the Jews in the early days of the cross of the church. So Paul writes, "We preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles." The chief priests and the teachers of the law were convinced that the King of Israel could not die on a cross. As Jesus evidently had, they concluded that he could not have been the King of Israel. Those who from the first were eyewitnesses declared what they had seen and asked how it should be understood. And they came to different conclusions about the relationship between kingship and crucifixion. The King of Israel was supposed to rule on David's throne forever, so death would seem to be incompatible with Jesus' claim to be the king. But Peter the Apostle recognized what was happening. In the book of Acts, he tells us that King David spoke of the resurrection of the Christ, that he was not abandoned to the grave, nor did his body see decay. In other words, it's part of the identification of the Christ that he should die and that he should be laid in the grave, though he should not stay there or decay. The chief priests and teachers of the law saw Jesus hung on a tree and could not reconcile the curse that it represented with the anointing of the Christ. But Paul realized what was happening here. Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. The chief priests and teachers of the law saw him fixed to the cross. They noted that he could not save himself, and they inferred that he had never been able to save others. But it was Isaiah, the prophet, who foresaw what would happen here. He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. And he continues, the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. In conclusion then, the early church, Christian believers, concluded that the death of the Christ was part of God's plan. They concluded also that the curse of the Christ was a part of God's plan. And they concluded that Jesus could not save himself because this on the cross was how he saved others. We join with the early disciples in declaring that Jesus is the King and was crucified for us.